Thank you, Aaron. Now, like many of you, this has been one of the strangest weeks I've lived. The intense emotions, the waiting, the back and forth, a lack of closure finally ending yesterday with the big news. Like many of you, Kristen and I were excited, although nervous, to watch the returns on Tuesday night. We got ready, we ordered Indian food, we cleaned the apartment, helping us stay occupied and work out some of our anxious energy that had nowhere else to go. We watched CNN, which seemed like the most middle of the networks. But even so, they loved playing with our emotions, playing dramatic music that raised your blood pressure, coupled with key race alerts that didn't actually say anything new. After all of that adrenaline pumping excitement, we went to bed around 11, pretty early, when it looked like most of the counters had slowed down and few results were going to come in. But it was clear by that point that the polls were way off again. I went to bed not feeling very good. Sleep was restless. My dreams were melancholy. I had one where I was wandering the streets of my hometown in Wisconsin, completely alone, the street lights showing some dark bushes and trees. I was trying to understand in my mind what was happening. Awake at various times during the night, I tried to stop myself from spiraling towards worst-case scenarios. Emotionally, I knew the race wasn't over, but even so, I felt defeated. Because as Unitarian Universalists, beyond politics and candidates, there are certain things that I have to admit I really want. I want a government that treats people with respect and compassion. I want leaders that I can look up to, knowing that they are at least trying to do what is right, even if I don't agree with them all the time. I want an election where democracy itself doesn't feel like it's at stake, where the opposition isn't the same as an enemy. I want to feel safe around my fellow citizens, that we can agree on basic moral principles, that we are better than the past few years, and that we as a country had come to see that. I know that many of you here on this call, here at Fourth Universalist, share these wants. And as I tossed and I turned on election night, it felt like these desires were being dashed. No matter who won, there would be no clear moral consensus, no grand repudiation of the anti-democratic tilt of our government, no great awakening that the cruelty, dishonesty, and baseness of the past 4 years was intolerable to our collective moral conscience. The race remained close on Tuesday night, and it remains close even now. It has been called. As I imagine what another 4 years might be like, I realized how hard the past few years had already been on me emotionally. The feeling of not understanding my own country or fellow citizens, of feeling like we lived in different worlds, of having to defend my heart and sanity against nihilistic and malicious gaslighting. Each time another moral line was crossed and it was normalized, my heart ached. I felt worn just thinking of another 4 years. It is not good for the soul to live in a world that is callous, a world that celebrates cruelty and mocks compassion and gleefully undermines truth. It's exhausting and disheartening. That restless night, I had hoped I would get some relief, that our country would redeem itself and I could go back to believing in it. Part of it is how I was raised as a child. I was taught to believe that our country was good, fundamentally good. The story I told was back in the 90s, our economy was booming. America had just triumphed over the Soviet Union, proving that democracy and capitalism and our values were the best and also going to win the future. It was a time so poised for peace that people spoke to the end of history. I learned growing up that racism had been defeated in the 60s, and we had all learned a lot since then. I learned about recycling, I watched Captain Planet, and I felt sure that we could save the Earth. We just gave it a little time. I learned that the American soldiers in the Persian Gulf and Kosovo were there to save lives, to stop genocide. and stop cruel dictators. I learned that drugs were bad, but if we were strong and we were virtuous, we could just say no and we would be safe. I was taught that America was good and it was getting better. It was all working itself out like it should. On Tuesday night, I realized how comforting this was, even if I didn't realize it. It is good to feel like things are working out, to think you know how the world is, how pleased I had been at what it was becoming. I grappled this week with the possibility that this image of America was simply a lie. My hope had been, perhaps naively, that these past 4 years were an aberration, a blip, a bad dream that we would wake up from, thanks to the inherent goodness of Americans, who realized overwhelmingly that something was wrong. My fear was becoming that actually these past few years were what Americans were and really wanted. And that would be our future, instead of the future I believed in my entire life. I've heard it said that a religious experience, that it happens when the world you dream about, you yearn for, you believe in, aligns with how the world actually is. It's when our hopes and aspirations match reality. When that happens, it's a religious experience. It's a beautiful thing. It feels perfect. But when the opposite happens, or threatens to happen, we are hit with disorientation, despair, and at times paralysis. The ground moves beneath us. Our worldview is shaken. I grew up with the privilege to believe in America and its possibility. I grew up benefiting from the best our country has to offer, exposed to its lingering and still unexposed to its lingering and active systems of oppression. I know that for many in our country and many on this call, there are no illusions like this. No naivete, no surprise in seeing just how close this election was, either in 2016 or this year. Some of you here I know are wiser than I have been, have experienced the brokenness of this country clearly in your life or your ancestors' lives. That America has never been what they taught me in school. You may have been frustrated, angry even, at the ignorance of those with privilege who have only recently begun to understand what has been clear for so long. We with privilege have a lot to learn from those who had to struggle with their country their entire life. We have a lot to learn about emotional resiliency, but not tying our joy and our hope to a world prone to heartbreak and meanness and injustice. This is not a privileged person problem alone. It is also a Unitarian Universalist problem because our theology is steeped in this privileged belief about progress. Yes, so many of us are happy that Biden won, but it was not a domination of progressive values across this country. A lot of good people lost election. We can't celebrate just because of that. We have to understand that the belief in progress is in some ways an idolatry. It reflects a belief in the inherent progress here on earth, which, if we are not privileged, is a hard sell, especially for those who've tremendously suffered for generations. The progressive theology that so many of us hold reflects a belief in the goodness of people, a hard sell for those of us who have, in this world, in this country, who have suffered time and time again. People whose ancestors were enslaved, people who have been in prison, incarcerated, deported. The ideas of progress and human goodness are powerful because they make Unitarian Universalists and those religious progressives feel safe and comforted. Things will be okay, we tell ourselves. We help, we understand the world. Helen Keller once said that safety is mostly a superstition. It is, and our faith needs a firmer foundation, a way not to feel so emotionally tied up and broken or overwhelmed when the world does not meet our expectations. If there's anything we should learn from the last 4 years, it's that democracy is fragile. The human heart is corruptible. The world is not safe, nor is progress guaranteed. An election result that many cheered yesterday does not change any of that. We are always on this razor's edge. So what do we do? The solution, of course, is not to give up on this world. It's not to say, I can't handle this stress. I want to stop believing in progress or stop working for change. We know it is possible, this world we believe in. We just have to know it isn't guaranteed. I actually think that religious conservatives have something to teach us here. For many of them, their theology begins in a very different place than the more optimistic Unitarian Universalist theology. This religious conservatism doesn't assume that people are inherently good or that goodness will inherently win out. They talk about sin and the fall of humanity, but also about biblical stories about corrupt leaders of Israel, idolatries at the golden calf. Even the execution of Jesus and his disciples was a clear and decisive victory on earth for an oppressive government over a wise and beloved man who people loved. There are no illusions there in that kind of theology of some divinely inspired progress. There's realism, the knowledge that the road is long and it's hard, and history is undoubtedly full of suffering. But neither does it lack hope. Neither does it believe we are powerless. The world is still worth fighting for. If we are to be in this struggle without despairing, we need to recognize and truly understand that we are guaranteed nothing. And that when all else is equal, power wins out, which is rarely wedded to justice. Our struggle becomes not a march towards victory, but an act of rebellion against a world that is stacked against us. It becomes an act of courage to believe and hope for justice, even though history repeats itself, even though tyrants don't always fall. If we truly embrace what we are up against, our defeats won't seem so devastating. We won't stay late up at night and wonder how this could happen, poised on the edge of victory, triumph, and crippling despair. We will know why, because the world and its people are what they are. They are susceptible both to great beauty and love, but also great illusion and cruelty and self-interest. Now that we know the results of this election, we can let ourselves breathe. We can feel good that so many of us worked hard to get out the vote, to register people who had been suppressed, who had been disadvantaged. That is a huge triumph for democracy, for our country, for the world, for humanity. Justice won a lot of victories this week, but it lost some too. So this work of liberation continues. We know this is not the end of fake news or white supremacy or voter suppression, and this will not be the last close or divisive election. Donald Trump will not be the last person to be elected to office that seems to so debase the office that he holds. But this year, you have fought the good fight. Here in this congregation, we have planted seeds that the next generation will harvest. You have sided with love and justice in the time that you have been given, the time you have graced the world with your body. And that is all we can do. Friends, the work is immense. The world and the people will be what they are, but there is always reasons for hope. Not because victory is guaranteed, but because we know it is possible. And so we continue. We fight, we organize, we believe, always together, always hoping. May it be so now and in the many years to come. Amen.